Let's get right into it. Number 10. The nuclear accident in Goldsboro. A B-52 bomber carrying 2 nuclear bombs began to disintegrate in midair over North Carolina in 1961. It's not ideal when you have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the whole East Coast. The strength of each bomb was 250 times greater than that of the bomb unleashed on Hiroshima. In essence, it resembled 2 miniature suns descending from the sky. One bomb buried itself deep in a muddy field after striking the earth at 700 mph. On its parachute, the second one glided down. 6 safety switches were included with these bombs to keep them from accidentally detonating. On the softly landing bomb, out of those 6 switches, 5 malfunctioned. All that stood between the East Coast and turning into a massive illuminated parking lot was a single, little switch, likely worth around 20 cents. The military dug up the buried explosive for days. They only discovered pieces of it. Even now, some fragments remain 180 feet beneath. They purchased the land and posted a sign that read, "Do not dig here." That field is now used by a local farmer to raise soybeans. His soybeans are arguably the most closely guarded in the United States. Then, according to a nuclear weapons expert, we came closer to nuking North Carolina than we ever did during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Vasa is the 9th. Imagine spending 2 years creating the most costly ship ever constructed, only to have it sink after only 1/300 meters of travel. Sweden's attempt to construct the most potent warship in the world was the Vasa. In essence, the ship was a floating castle with 64 bronze cannons and ornate wooden sculptures. The king wanted it to appear so menacing that the mere sight of it would cause enemy ships to surrender. However, there was a small issue. It was too slender and tall. In essence, they believed a mansion would float by placing it atop a boat. During testing, 30 sailors rushing back and forth across the deck nearly capsized the ship because it was so unsteady. However, they simply ordered the sailors to stop running rather than addressing the issue. They threw an enormous party on the day of the launch. Families of the crew were among the thousands lining the waterfront. Those gleaming cannons were on display in the open gun ports. The ship was then struck by a slight breeze. It's a light breeze that hardly moves your hair. No storm, no enormous waves. One side of the ship slanted. Through the exposed cannon apertures, water began to flow in. During a car wash, it was similar to forgetting to close the windows. The Vasa sank right there in the harbor in front of everyone. After 2 years of construction, a very costly fish motel was completed in around 20 minutes. The failure of the Mars Climate Orbiter is number 8. Because someone neglected to convert inches to centimes, NASA's $327 million spacecraft vanished. Like a space weatherman, the spacecraft was intended to study the weather on Mars. However, it ultimately performed an extremely costly impersonation of a shooting star rather than orbiting Mars. While one team used metric units for their calculations, another used pounds. These mismatched figures caused the orbiter to fly far too near to Mars when it was time to enter its orbit. Mars's sparse atmosphere might as well be a brick wall at the speed of spacecraft. The orbiter essentially broke apart because it was not designed to withstand that level of pressure. Throughout the whole 9-month trip to Mars, no one noticed this error. Driving across the country and then realizing at the end that you've been reading the map incorrectly is like that. The Bible's terrible number 7. When 2 printers committed a grave error in 1631, the king ordered their execution. Their only task was to print Bible copies, but they managed to utter a single, insignificant word that had a profound impact. The word not. Therefore, their version said, "Thou shalt commit adultery," rather than, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." The order for his subjects to cheat on their spouses infuriated King Charles IV. He gave the order to hunt down and burn every copy of what became known as the Wicked Bible. The printers were taken to court, fined heavily, and had their printing license revoked. During that time, another edition inadvertently printed, "Printers have persecuted me, instead of princes have persecuted me." In light of what transpired with these men, this error proved to be unintentionally prophetic. Rather than burning their copies, several people chose to keep them. Only perhaps 10 copies remain now. It is one of the most valuable typos in history, with each one valued at over $100,000. The Great Boston Molasses Flood comes in at number 6. In the north end of Boston, a huge tank held 2.3 million gallons of molasses. It was as tall as a 5-story structure. For months, the tank had been leaking. For free candy, children would even gather the dripping molasses in buckets. To cover up the leaks, the business simply painted the tank brown. The tank's walls eventually gave out on January 15, 1919. The streets were smashed by a 35 mph molasses surge. The wave knocked structures right off their foundations. It lifted a whole firehouse and transported it. An elevated railroad track was torn apart like a piece of paper. People were unable to swim when they plunged into this gunk. They sank deeper the harder they struggled. It was like drowning in slow motion. It was a nightmare to clean. While attempting to rescue stranded individuals, rescuers became stuck. For months, everything remained sticky until they found that the molasses could be broken down by salt water. Some victims were discovered in molasses, essentially mummified. The business attempted to point the finger at anarchist bombers, but they simply constructed the tank too cheaply and thinly. The design was not even reviewed by an engineer. They simply advised a few men to put their heads together and hope for the best. Locals still claim that you can still smell molasses in that area of Boston on sweltering summer days. The fifth is the collapse of the bridge in Tacoma. There was a wind-dancing bridge in Washington state in 1940. Because it would sway and bounce like a gigantic jump rope, they called it Galloping Gertie. The developers essentially constructed a gigantic wind instrument since they were so intent on making it appear cool. Thinking they were being clever, they made it extremely light and thin. This bridge began to flutter in a process known as aero-elastic flutter when wind struck it. Imagine blowing on a piece of paper while holding it by its edge. Observe the up and down waves. Imagine that now. However, it's a huge bridge with automobiles on it. The wind increased and the bridge began its last dance on November 7th. The entire building was contorting like a damp towel being wrung out. A man's car stalled and he became stuck on the bridge. To get out, he had to crawl on his hands and knees. His dog became the sole victim of the bridge because it would not move. The Titanic's poor rivets come in at number 4. An iceberg alone did not bring down the Titanic. Millions of small metal pins betrayed it too. The unsinkable ship was actually held together by these rivets, which are about the size of your thumb. More than 3 million rivets were utilized on the Titanic, but instead of using top-quality iron, they went with the dollar store variety. These rivets had only one task when the ship struck the iceberg: hold the steel plates together. Rather, they protruded like buttons on trousers. A few rivets failing after Thanksgiving meal set off a chain reaction. Imagine the entire garment unraveling when you remove a single loose thread. With freezing water pouring in through every opening, that is exactly what happened to the Titanic. It was all about making things fancy for the firm. Mahogany that, gold-plated this. In the meantime, the ship's structural components were less expensive than the dinner plates. The Great London Beer Flood comes in third. A 15-foot beer wave smashed through the streets of London in 1814. The Horseshoe Brewery included a huge 22-foot-tall wooden tank that could accommodate 3,500 barrels of beer. This monster was held together by iron hoops, but one of them broke. Only a small crack. Similar to when the buckle on your belt breaks. The employees disregarded it. Their first and last error was that. The entire tank burst within an hour, bringing additional tanks down with it. Like a tidal wave, 320,000 gallons of hot fermenting beer exploded forth. Like a tsunami, the beer wave swept across the impoverished St. Giles neighborhood. Beds, tables, and chairs were thrown about like toys in a bathtub. There was little hope for those who lived in basement houses. When the beer wave struck a mother's and daughter's home, they were enjoying tea. There was not even time for them to get to their feet. There was an Irish wake going on in another building. Their funeral was ruined by the beer flood, which made it their own. Some saw it as a free drink, while others were drowning in beer. To collect the beer, people rushed outside with buckets and pans. Some simply uttered their words and wished for the best. That day, 8 people drowned in the beer rather than drinking it. To avoid having to pay damages, the brewery claimed it was an act of God. The second is the Typo on the Tokyo Stock Exchange, which cost $2 billion. The most costly typo in history was likely made in 2005 by a person working for a Japanese bank. One of the company's shares was to be sold for 610,000 yen. Rather, they wrote in an order to sell 610,000 shares for 1 yen each by mistake. It would be like to offering 20,000 cars for $1 each, while attempting to sell yours for $20,000. The entire number of shares in the corporation was just 14,500. This individual attempted to sell 41 times as many shares as were actually in existence. The exchange's computer system simply refused the bank's frantic attempts to cancel the order. When other merchants saw what was going on, they pounced on it like blood-smelling sharks. During a pandemic, they began purchasing these dirt-cheap shares as if they were toilet paper. The error caused a panic in the Japanese stock market as a whole. The bank lost almost $225 million by the time everything was fully resolved. First, the failure of Mariner 1. The failure to draw a line over a letter cost NASA a $135 million spacecraft. The lack of punctuation is the culprit, not extraterrestrial life or space junk. NASA was attempting to launch its first probe to Venus in 1962. On launch day, everything appeared to be flawless. Beautifully, the rocket took off. Then it began performing something that resembled drunk driving more than space travel. There was a small code error in the guidance system. In the math equation, someone neglected to place a line over a letter. Like a baby who has had too much candy, the rocket began to zigzag around the sky. The computer kept sending out corrections, each of which made the situation worse. When their multi-million-dollar spacecraft chose to attempt interpretive dance, ground control looked on in horror. Before it could collide with the shipping channels of the Atlantic Ocean, they had to blow it up. That concludes today. I'll be doing more videos like this in the future. To view them, subscribe.